Good evening, everybody. I'm Roderick Floud, Provost of Gresham, and this is in some ways a slightly sad occasion for me, as it's going to be my last Provost lecture at Gresham. And I very much enjoyed, as I will say later on, my time with the college, and it's very pleasant to have my successor here this evening. What I'm going to do is to talk about More Means Better, 50 Years of Higher Education, because it's about 50 years since British higher education began to expand. And that expansion over the last 50 years has transformed our universities and in many ways our society. So I'm going to talk about the nature and consequences of that expansion and then move on to the ways in which I think British universities still need to change to meet and to thrive, meet the challenges and to thrive for the next 50 years. So, British higher education sorry, I'm getting there. British higher education, like much else, began to change in the 1960s. The report in 1963 of the Robbins Committee, a Royal Commission on the Future of Higher Education, produced the first 6 new, as they were then called, or plate glass, as they were also called, universities. And then, at the same time, we had the creation of the parallel polytechnic system. It was in response to this expansion that the English novelist Kingsley Amis produced the cri de coeur that more will mean worse. He argued forcefully that expanding the number of students would reduce their quality. The university education had always been and should remain restricted to a very small intellectual elite. Only very few, such as the tiny proportion of the population who then went to university, were clever enough to benefit from it. Amis was certainly not the first and certainly not the last to say this, although he probably phrased it most memorably. Since his time, similar arguments have been used to oppose the increased number of women in universities, the increased number of part-time students, the growth of academic research, and the transformation of polytechnics into universities. We've been told that graduate salaries will fall, that more and more graduates will be unemployed, that students would be better off not going to university and should be doing apprenticeships or having children. And most recently, the doomsayers have focused on high levels of student debt. So what's actually happened and what's likely to happen next? That's what I want to talk about. But perhaps for the benefit of some of the audience, these are the qualifications that I have for talking about the subject. The first is that I've lived through it. It's 50 years since I graduated from Oxford and started my doctorate in economic history. I've been fortunate to work in some of the best universities in the world and to shape policies on higher education in Britain and Europe. I've been able to teach and do research in an academic subject, economic history, which I still find fascinating. I spent 31 years altogether at 2 institutions, Birkbeck College and London Metropolitan University, as it now is, which have made together an enormous contribution to the higher education of adults and to members of black and minority and other ethnic communities who would otherwise have been denied such opportunities. And I've finally ended my career at a unique institution which I greatly admire. In other words, I've been very lucky in my career. It hasn't always been easy or enjoyable, but it's certainly never been a dull moment. So what has happened? To put it simply, we've had more of everything. More students, more women, more part-time students, more research, more Europe, more expansion throughout the world. We've certainly had more of everything than anyone foresaw, even Kingsley Amis in his worst dreams. Most of the expansion hasn't been, I would argue, the result of conscious policy. Instead, the supply of graduates seems roughly to have kept pace with the demand for them, without, in many cases, much conscious planning. Economies have grown, and particularly they've become more and more orientated towards services, away from manufacturing or growing things. And universities have grown with and within these service economies. The Labour government of 1997 was often derided for setting a supposed target of 50% of the age group to go to university. It wasn't actually a target at all, it was a prediction by that famously radical body, the Confederation of British Industries, of the likely demand for graduates in the 21st century. And that projection seems to be coming true. Demand for graduates continues to match supply. The graduate premium, the income, the advantage in income that graduates receive compared to non-graduates is continuing to be much the same. And as the economy emerges from recession, more and more graduates will be recruited. This is The Guardian expecting an 18% rise in graduate jobs in the next year. Now let me look at what more of everything has meant. More students first. This is the famous statement from the Robbins report, which firmly stated the case for expanding British universities. There were, Robbins realised, more people qualified by ability and attainment than the universities of the early 1960s were providing places for. He rejected the possibility of expanding existing universities sufficiently and opted for 6 new ones. And his predictions came true, the places were filled, and during the 1980s and 1990s there were then successive waves of expansion in the system. After I left Oxford and taught at UCL in Cambridge from 1965 to 1975, I benefited from this expansion. It was very easy to get a job at that point. But it was only when I got to Birkbeck in 1975 that I fully realised what Robbins had meant. There I found hundreds of students who were qualified by ability and attainment and immensely hard-working, but whom the old system, the system of an elite university, had failed, and we'd wasted their potential, and they were, in a sense, being rescued by Birkbeck. We would also, if we hadn't had the expansion, have wasted the potential of so many other people, the children of illiterate Bangladeshi migrants, whom we were able to attract to study at London Guildhall University, for example. So, more students meant more opportunity, and the numbers are substantial. It's quite difficult to actually get the numbers for, at least I've found it difficult to get the numbers for students in universities. So there is a gap here between 1962 and 1999. In 1963, when Robbins reported, there were 216,000 students. By 1999, there were well over 1 million, and today there are nearly 2 million. And I would argue that despite the dire warnings of Kingsley Amis, the quality of degrees has been maintained, and certainly it's true that the graduates from the expanding system have found jobs. The economic argument for expansion, important to Robbins, was amply justified. The result has been that a greater and greater proportion of people attend university. I was one of only 4% of my age group. A young person starting university today will be one of about 35% of hers. However, we have to admit that the growth in student numbers hasn't been a triumph for egalitarian social policies or widening participation, as it's now known. It's still almost as difficult for someone from the working classes, although that's a much smaller proportion of the population than it was, to get to university as it was in the 1960s. What the growth has been is a triumph for women, but principally middle-class women. In Britain and almost everywhere in the developed countries now, women either surpass or equal men among graduates. The only exceptions are Korea, South Korea, China, Turkey, and Japan. There are even more women students than men in Saudi Arabia. The UK is close to, but still below, the average for developed countries. Now, this is a startling and very rapid change, completely unenvisaged in the Robbins report, for example. He did recognise that there was a deficit in the number of women going to university, but didn't expect there to be such a transformation as occurred. Throughout the world, particularly in the developed world, men are now in a minority. Universities, as I say, didn't deliberately seek to recruit more women. Indeed, many of them sought to stem the tide. In the 1960s, I remember, it was a triumph that women were occasionally allowed to dine in my Oxford College hall, and that they could become members of the Oxford Union. I joined a Cambridge college as a fellow in 1969, at the start of 6 years of fierce debate about the admission of women as undergraduates. More will mean worse was mild by comparison. We were told that to admit women would be like admitting cats to a dog's home. We were assured, presumably on the basis of a spiritualist séance, that the founder of the college, Sir Walter Mildmay, a contemporary of Sir Thomas Gresham, would not have approved. We were told that the college could not afford to fit full-length mirrors in every bedroom, which was an absolute requirement for the admission for women students. We were told that there was a danger that women applicants to read English would be cleverer than the men and would therefore have to be admitted. And if a little woman was so successful as to win a Nobel Prize in 1964, this was the treatment that she then received. This is Dorothy Hodgkin. However, the tide couldn't be stemmed. I'm grateful for the Higher Education Policy Institute too, giving me this graph. Women from ethnic minority communities have helped it along. But now the participation rates among women are higher than those for men in England and in the rest of the UK. And the real problem, as has been highlighted in recent weeks, is with the lower participation rates of some of the male communities, particularly white working class males. I've been criticised when I've discussed this before for describing this as the triumph of women. Of course, there is much more to do. Women are still discouraged from careers in research. There are far too few female professors or vice-chancellors, and far too few women in politics, among judges, or at the top of FTSE 100 companies. But the change since the 1960s has been remarkable. Another change, which I think has been a British phenomenon, the increase in women is a worldwide or certainly European phenomenon. The growth of part-time students is a particularly British phenomenon, symbolised by that great success story, the Open University, but based on the work of the Mechanics Institutes, Birkbeck, and the technical colleges and polytechnics before them. And the expansion of part-time students in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s has also been a significant feature of the expansion I've been talking about. Until recently, when the number of part-time undergraduates has started a sharp fall as a result, I think, absolutely directly of government funding policies. This is really to be regretted and must be reversed. Places like Birkbeck and most of the former polytechnics have done a tremendous job in increasing the skills of the population through part-time study. It takes second place to the appeal of part-time study and giving second chances, but it's still extremely important economically. It's frankly stupid of the government to discourage people from seeking to improve and widen their skills. Carrying on with my mores. More students means more teachers, and since the main qualification for being a university teacher is to be a good researcher, more teachers means more research. In addition, governments around the world, on rather flimsy evidence, have become convinced that economic growth depends on innovation and that innovation depends on research. Even in bad times, therefore, they've protected academic research from the worst of the cuts. Gordon Brown boosted spending on university research, and George Osborne, Vince Cable, and David Willits have done the same. The result throughout the world has been an explosion of academic journals and of the number of articles that they publish. Keeping track of them all has become an industry in itself, abounding with league tables and citation indices as academics strive to get their results published in the best peer-reviewed journals. Britain, it has to be said, is very good at all this. We're responsible, we have 1% of the world population, we spend a third of the world funding on research, and as you can see, we get a very good result from the amount that we spend in terms of citations and the most highly cited papers. So more research, at least as far as Britain is concerned, seems to have been another great success. Now for two successes which most of you won't have heard of: the European higher education area and the European research area. Firstly, the European higher education area, sometimes called the Bologna process. With virtually no publicity in this country, but considerable amount in other parts of Europe, in the last 15 years we've achieved a common structure of undergraduate and postgraduate degrees across the whole of Europe, stretching indeed from Reykjavik to Vladivostok, and from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean and the Caspian Seas. It produces unlikely bedfellows. I remember being at a meeting of the Bologna process when we simultaneously admitted Russia and the Holy See to membership of the process. And although one doesn't say it too loudly, the model that all these countries have adopted, far wider than the European Union, I should point out, the model that they've adopted is the British model, with short undergraduate degrees followed by masters and PhDs, or Anglo-American, perhaps one should say. So there's been a transformation of the structures of European higher education, and at the same time, millions of students have experienced higher education in countries other than their own through the European Union's Erasmus programs, which allows them to study for a term or year in a different university. The second success has been in the European research area, across the EU and its associated countries. EU research programs and cooperation between national research funding agencies has really been a tremendous success, mobilizing the best researchers to deal with common problems. They make it possible for researchers to meet and discuss their ideas. Britain does particularly well from this funding, reflecting its strength in research, and gets out of it far more than we put in. The Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge recently estimated that universities like his receive 15 to 20% of their funding for research from the EU. It's very important that this is recognized, because it could all be put at risk by the Eurosceptics, as similar Eurosceptics in Switzerland have just demonstrated. And that is a serious risk for the future of British research and British science. Finally, in my summary of what's happened, this graph in a sense says it all. We think that our expansion in student numbers has been rapid. Some people continue to think it's been too rapid. But look further afield. Growth in Europe and North America, indeed in the developed countries as a whole, has recently been puny, compared to growth in the rest of the world. Governments, think of China and India, see universities and their graduates as the key to economic growth. There are now twice as many people enrolled in tertiary education in countries outside the developed world as there are within it, and the disparity is growing. Along with it goes more research, more development in those countries, more innovation as their workforces become more highly skilled. Countries like Britain have traded for decades on having a more highly skilled workforce, but that advantage is rapidly diminishing. This is the moment that our government has chosen actively to discourage the international students who for decades have kept British universities solvent while they study here. Until recently, and you can see how extraordinarily attractive the UK has been to international students, until recently those students returned to their own countries to speak highly of British higher education. Now, by contrast, they feel unwelcome, and they are unwelcome to a government which is desperate to cut immigration by any means. Most people don't realise, I think, that students, if they intend to stay longer than a year, are a major part of the numbers for net immigration which grab the headlines. This is absurd. Few of those international students want to stay in this country, certainly when they're received in the way that they've been recently, after they graduate. So they're not, quote, taking jobs from hard-working British people, as UKIP and the Conservative rhetoric goes. It's extraordinary that the government persists in counting students as immigrants and therefore as its prime target for cutting immigration. Let us hope that they fail. If they were to succeed, they would probably destroy a significant number of British universities. Vice-Chancellors don't like to admit how vulnerable their financial models are to a decline in overseas students. But since I'm no longer a Vice-Chancellor, I can say it. This slide shows how many British universities there are, including most of the most successful and the most prestigious, who couldn't do without the income from overseas students. Take it away and you will jeopardize the universities which educate many of our children and grandchildren. The only way for them to survive would be to put up their fees, which of course the government won't let them do, to much more than the current level of £9,000. So the policy, and this is not a political statement, it's a statement on behalf of sense and the universities, the policy is frankly mad. Not the only mad policy in higher education, but one of them. So overall, if I can sum up, more has meant better. British higher education has been a great success. Without the expansion of universities, we wouldn't have ended discrimination against women in education. We wouldn't have allowed millions of our fellow citizens to fulfill their potential through full and part-time study. We wouldn't have achieved our place as the leading country in research in Europe across the whole spectrum of the sciences, humanities and social sciences. The dire consequences which Kingsley Amis foresaw, but which Robbins refuted, haven't come to pass. Of course, we need to continue to worry about the quality of teaching and learning in British higher education, but British university courses are now far better designed, far more professionally delivered, certainly than when I began my career. And there are a whole range of other benefits from the growth of universities. Graduates are happier, they're less prone to crime, they're more likely to take part in social, cultural and charitable activities than are non-graduates. They're even less likely to be obese. Graduate unemployment has risen less rapidly than general unemployment and is falling more rapidly. It's good to be a graduate and good that we have so many of them. But now let me turn to the future. I have one major prediction, which is that expansion will continue, and I'll explain why in a moment. But I am also concerned about the future. We have a messy, muddled, non-system of higher education in this country. The policies for higher education aren't coherent, they're not thought out. We need to think again, as Robbins did 50 years ago, about the whole future of British universities and about the ways in which they could work better for themselves and for future generations of students. So for the rest of this lecture, I'll discuss areas where the current state of British higher education could, I think, be improved. I'm inevitably going to be critical, perhaps provocative. So I want to make it clear that I greatly admire the people who run Britain's universities, my colleagues for 50 years, the academics and administrators who work in them. In my experience, they love their jobs, and they love their jobs because they believe they can make a difference to our society, either by increasing our knowledge through research or by teaching succeeding generations of students. University employment isn't well paid by the standards of many other jobs, which demand such qualifications as university teachers have, but those who do these jobs know that they're worthwhile, and they're great people to work with. I think they also enjoy their jobs, which is important. In the 19th century, clergymen had the highest life expectancy of any occupation. Today it's academics, and that probably says something about their job satisfaction. So what about the future? Where are we going? Firstly, I would confidently predict that expansion will continue and that the results will continue to be good. And why do I say this? The first point is that we still have, compared to many other countries, relatively few people going to universities. I've been emphasizing expansion, but we're not at the top of league tables of participation, as some politicians seem to think. Instead, as this graph shows, we're roughly in the middle among developed countries. I would argue that we have to continue the expansion because all these other countries are expanding and we can't afford to slip further down the league. We're already far behind comparable countries like Australia, the United States, and other European countries, and there are many others coming up rapidly behind us. We are a service economy, and a service economy needs more and more trained professionals and graduates. And I would predict that therefore, the expansion of the universities will continue. The second reason is that the imposition of the highest fees in the world for a publicly funded system of higher education has hardly dented the demand for university places, with the significant and worrying exception, as I said earlier, of part-time places. And the demand seems to be continuing. George Osborne recently astonished the university world by announcing a lifting of the cap on undergraduate numbers. Few of us think that the sums add up, but the new policy is a signal that the government thinks people will continue to want to come to university. And this is about undergraduates. The demand to do master's degrees and doctorates continues to be strong and could be even stronger if we didn't discourage overseas students, as I said earlier on. Now, despite this, all is not well. The successes that I've described were achieved with very little conscious planning. Really, there's been no advance since 1963 in the Robbins terms, as he described it, of introducing coordinating principles and a general conception of the objectives of the higher education system. He'd said there wasn't a system of higher education in 1963, and there still isn't one. The funding system is so complex that it defies description. I can remember trying to explain the funding system to the governors of my university, all of them successful business people who were appalled that we should be trying to manage a system in the way that the funding system of the time demanded. And at the same time, we have entrenched privilege in higher education, which has changed little since the 1960s. So the system is certainly not delivering some of the goals which Robbins and others pointed to. There was Michael Gove, somebody I don't usually quote with enthusiasm, who pointed out recently that there are more Etonians at Oxbridge than young people who received free school meals. There are more black and minority ethnic students at London Metropolitan University than in the whole of the Russell Group of elite universities. And these aren't the only problems of the current system. The Public Accounts Committee has serious doubts that the current system of student fee support is sustainable. It's already clear that if anyone in government believed that it would save money to introduce £9,000 fees, they will be wrong. Meanwhile, as I've said, the government seems to be hell-bent on destroying the success in recruiting international students, which benefits the UK economy by several £billion a year. We have universities which are supposedly autonomous, independent institutions, but are actually entirely dependent on public money, or quasi-public money coming through the loan system and the fees. We have universities which are supposed and urged by the government to compete, but until recently couldn't alter their student numbers or change their fees. But Bahram Bekradnia of the Higher Education Policy Institute recently described the fee system as an omnishambles, but in my view, it's not only the fee system, but the whole non-system of universities that deserves that term. As Robbins realized, there really isn't a system, and it's still true. There are no guiding principles or agreed objectives for the spending of huge sums of public money. Some of the greatest universities in the world share the funding with private institutions which, it is arguable, have been established to milk the student loan system, as indeed has happened in another country, the United States. And there's nothing to stop it happening here. Now, you can defend this omnishambles as a result of organic development and free competition, although actually there isn't any free competition, and as necessary for the preservation of academic freedom. Robbins actually considered that 50 years ago, that argument about academic freedom, and disposed of it. Academic freedom is the right of individuals, like myself, to express opinions which may be unpopular. It's not a justification for the existence or status of any particular institution. So there is an argument, bolstered by the successes which I've just described, to let things continue to muddle along. My alma mater, the University of Oxford, has stayed one of the best universities in the world despite a governance system which breaks most of the rules in the book. But I think higher education is now too important to our economy and society to let it muddle along. We do need to take a look at the system as a whole, not just odd bits of it, like fees for undergraduates. It's extraordinary that we've had a whole change in policy introducing huge fees by international standards for undergraduates without considering the possible impacts of that on the rest of the system. What we really need 50 years on is another Robbins Commission, which can, as Robbins tried to do, design a system fit for this century. But their Royal Commissions are out of favour. The Institute for Public Policy Research last year tried to fill the gap, and their committee, chaired by Nigel Thrift, reported and made 23 major recommendations. Most of them I agree with, but I think they're tinkering with the system. They're about improving the position in various marginal ways rather than considering the first principles which underlie what a university system might be about. So I think we need to think seriously about how many universities we have, about what they do, about how we pay for the teaching and research that they do. I believe that we have too many universities, that they're trying to do too many different things, and that the way in which we fund their research in particular is fundamentally flawed. Because there's been so much discussion about funding for teaching, I'm going to ignore that topic, but you can accept that I think that's flawed too. And I would further argue that the idea that universities can make up for the deficiencies of the current funding systems by fundraising from alumni or through philanthropy is a chimera. So, first, I think we've got too many universities trying to do too many things. No one seems to know how many universities there are worldwide, but there are probably about 1,500 to 2,000 in Europe. One of the oddities of the European system is that all of them, almost all of them, can award doctoral degrees, in contrast to the United States, where only a small proportion can do so. So that they're teaching across the full spectrum of courses, bachelor's, master's, and PhD. In Britain, there are 134 members of Universities UK. While London Higher, which represents the wider category of higher education institutions in London, has 40 members within the M25. In fact, the situation is even worse, I was going to say. It was more complex than that, because there are many other higher education institutions in London. We are now getting the phenomenon of branch campuses of universities from the rest of the country being set up in London, from England and from Scotland and from, I don't know, from Wales. I would simply argue that it's too many. It's a confusing pattern, and it's probably, I think, very likely an inefficient system. Each institution, from the largest university to the smallest conservatoire or higher education college, has a board of governors, a vice-chancellor, a principal, a finance department, an HR department, a registry, an admissions office, a fundraising office, and so on and so on and so on. I would argue the overhead is simply too great. So my first proposal, which I would make to a Royal Commission on higher education if there were to be one, is to cut the number of universities in Britain by at least a third, if not a half. We don't need 2 or more universities in each of our major cities glowering at each other and competing to attract the attractions of business and local authorities. Why do Leeds or Sheffield or Oxford or several other cities which you can pick at random need 2 vice-chancellors, 2 registrars, 2 groups of governors, 2 of all the other panoply of administration that I've just listed? Is it really necessary to have 2 universities outside Brighton, separated only by a main road? In London, we have colleges which are all nominally part of the University of London, competing to remain independent from each other and recoiling at any suggestion of joining forces with parvenus such as London Met, Westminster or Kingston. We have conservatoires and art colleges which could perfectly well be faculties of a larger university. Now, my experience generally suggests that universities won't make such radical changes for themselves. Indeed, it's arguable, and this is part of the problem, that their articles of association, their charitable status, their vice-chancellors and their board of governors exist to defend their separate existences. And therefore, reducing the number of universities, not reducing the number of students, but simply the number of institutions dealing with those students, is a very difficult thing to do. The Higher Education Funding Council has, I believe, remained supine in the face of this. They have taken the view that it's their job to fund, not to plan the system, and that seems to me to be part of the problem. In Wales, the Welsh government has stepped in to reduce the number of universities in that country, and maybe the next English government will have to do the same. At the same time, universities are simply trying to do too many things at once. They're trying to be hoteliers, conference organisers, caterers, sporting promoters, careers advisors, pastoral counsellors. They run great estates, they house research institutes, they provide theatres and concert halls, they sell souvenirs and t-shirts, they act as property developers, they invest on the stock market. They set up overseas subsidiaries, they finance start-up companies, they develop science parks, they maintain some of the most beautiful buildings in Britain, they run some of our greatest museums, art galleries and libraries. They even run buses. Occasionally they teach and do research. I was trying to think about what comparable institutions one can think of that have a range of activities similar to those of the modern university. And the comparison that I came up with, and I don't think it's a particularly happy one, is the so-called professional service industries, Capita, G4S and the like. Do we really want to model universities on that basis? It's interesting to speculate about why all this has occurred. Why are universities like this? I think it must be a hangover from the time when universities were detached from the world, living in a rural or small town cocoon and teaching 18-year-olds fresh out of boarding school who needed to be looked after and provided with a full range of services because they couldn't possibly look after themselves. Maybe then universities did need to do everything. But now, surely that's not true. Most universities are in the middle of big cities. They don't need to do all these things. It's even odder that they continue to do it on an academic cycle of term and vacation that was established in the Middle Ages. And as a result, they're wasting a large number of their assets. Expensive real estate often goes empty for large parts of the year. So universities, I believe, there are too many of them, and I believe they're trying to do too many things. There's duplication and waste in academic as well as administrative affairs. Surely in an age when every student can download a lecture onto a tablet or smartphone, we don't have to have several sets of lectures going on in each of our major cities on the same topic, probably at the same time. Nor, probably, does it make sense for lectures to be repeated in successive years with only minor changes. Providing lectures to smartphones and tablets, as in the bottom picture, rather than expecting students to sit in lecture audiences, would free lecturers from the need to spend so much time giving traditional lectures and give them more time, I believe, for real interaction with students in seminars and classes. This might enhance student satisfaction, which is wilting under the combined impact of high tuition fees and the continued unwillingness of research stars to undertake undergraduate teaching. But again, I think the only way one's going to be able to achieve this specialisation and reduction in duplication is through merger rather than cooperation. I do think there is a strong argument for specialisation in the form of universities which concentrate entirely on postgraduate education. The best researchers are already in many places concentrating on masters and PhD students and leaving the undergraduates to junior staff or teaching assistants, many of them now on 0 hours contracts. It was the Robbins Committee 50 years ago which discussed whether Oxford and Cambridge should become all graduate institutions. They rejected the idea. They argued that it would be too great a change to the character of Oxbridge and that in any case at that time only 18% of their students were postgraduates. Now the proportion is much larger, as it is at the other great research-led universities such as LSE, Imperial and UCL, together with some of the best specialist universities such as the Institute of Education and the School of Hygiene. Turning Oxbridge into all graduate institutions has been discussed sotto voce in common rooms for years, and it's probably time that another commission like Robbins had a proper and open debate about it again. If we were to organise the university system so that many academics explicitly concentrated on research and postgraduate teaching, we would certainly need to modify the system of research funding in our universities. But I think that needs modifying anyway. A good part of our current system is, in my view, an expensive charade. This slide describes the four most important sources of money for university research. Europe's increasingly significant, charities are important, very important. Private industry funds less proportionately than in many other countries, but is still significant. But every year, the first source, the state, provides more than £4.5 billion for research in this country. In two parts, it's the system known as dual support, 2/3 through the research councils, 1/3 through the higher education funding councils. In the 1980s, under the impact of Thatcherite funding cuts, Britain pioneered the assessment of university research, and it's been followed throughout the world. The books and articles of academic staff have been scrutinised by panels of their peers every 5 or 6 years. And through an increasingly elaborated and almost time-consuming process, academic departments have been assigned a grade. This grade is then translated into funding and produces a distribution of the £1.5 billion per year, which I mentioned a few moments ago. Now, I believe in research assessment. It's entirely right that public money should be properly spent and be seen to be spent on the best of academic research. But the practice of research assessment is a different matter. Each assessment costs between 20 and 100 million pounds, depending on whose estimates one accepts. That may not seem very much if one is distributing over £6 billion or more, that's over 5 or 6 years, between each successive assessment. But it's still an enormous waste of money for the very simple reason that it doesn't lead, and has never led, to any significant change in funding for the universities. To demonstrate this, look at this graph. This shows you the change in the share of research funding between 1995 and 2014 going to the top universities. Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial and UCL still get almost the same proportion of the cake as they did 20 or 30 years ago. Only 3 universities, Imperial, Oxford and UCL, have changed their share of the cake by more than 1 percentage point. And that's not because of any change in them, it's because the system was tweaked to reward the most highly graded. For the rest, as you can see, there has been virtually no change in the share that they have received. What's the point of a system that doesn't change anything? What's the point of successive assessments, 20, 100 million pounds, that doesn't change anything? It would be much easier, much simpler, simply to give them the same share each time. That's probably a step too far for government or the funding council, even if that is essentially what has happened. We have been giving exactly the same amount of money to all these universities over a 15 year period, and probably, in fact, if you go back to the early days of the research assessment, I think you probably find exactly the same numbers there too. I think this system is simply a waste of money. So I have a better solution for it. That is that although the assessment of research by the Higher Education Funding Council gets all the attention, it actually accounts for only a third of public funding. The other 2/3 is distributed by the research councils. So my solution is to take all the money and distribute it through the research councils. The current system is beloved of the vice-chancellors of universities here because it gives them a big sum of money which, at least in theory, they can distribute as they wish. It's also actually a system which is beloved by a lot of academics. They're intensely competitive people and they love league tables, particularly if they're the people sitting in judgment on the research of their friends. But it is, I believe, an expensive charade. And of course, and this is a final reason, the world leader in research, the United States, allocates its funds through research councils or the equivalent, and there's no equivalent of our research assessment system. My fourth prescription for a healthy higher education sector in Britain is to forget about fundraising, in the sense of soliciting donations from rich people. The pressure to raise funds from alumni and rich donors came from a series of misunderstandings of American universities. People who should have known or been told better, like Gordon Brown, thought that fundraising for a tiny proportion of American universities, principally those in the Ivy League, could be translated into sizable donations, significant donations, not only to Oxbridge, but to the general run of British universities. This ignored the fact that most US universities in the state systems didn't and don't receive much such funding, except occasionally to fund a football stadium. It also ignored the fact, as one American university president put it to me, fundraising for universities in America is a branch of the tax avoidance industry. It depends on tax advantages which fortunately don't exist in Britain. Finally, it ignored the fact that donations to most British universities were at such a low level that extraordinary increases would be needed to make any difference at all to the general run of university finances. Now, 20 or 30 years since such pressure to fundraise began, I think the results have been very poor indeed. About 80% of all the funds raised go to Russell Group universities, and of those, 50% are to Oxbridge. Oxbridge secures 100 times as much in new donations as all the 15 million plus universities, principally the former polytechnics. No one knows how much of this money is for academic purposes, rather than providing ever more luxurious accommodation for undergraduates to underpin the vacation conference trade. Now, I was proud of what we raised at London Guildhall University, £4.5 million for the Women's Library, with Diane Hopkin down here. But for most vice-chancellors, I think, would admit that many of the donations have not been for their top academic priorities, and that far too much has gone into bricks and mortar rather than teaching and learning. But the juggernaut rolls on. Vice-chancellors and heads of Oxbridge colleges are now expected to be supplicants for gifts rather than academic leaders or university managers. The Higher Education Funding Council has set universities a target of raising £2 billion per annum to substitute for cuts in public funding. The fundraisers calculate, they would, wouldn't they, that this will need to double the number of fundraising staff in universities. If that happened, it would mean we had more fundraisers than academic staff in, to take two examples, architecture and planning, or in agriculture and veterinary science. The quote, development workforce would be 1/3 of the number of academic staff in the whole of the humanities. This, in my view, is sheer madness. Universities aren't, except in the strict legal sense of the word, charities. They're big businesses now, as I demonstrated earlier on. And it's absurd that they should be expected by the state and its agencies to rely on donations which attract charitable tax relief. They should be funded by the state to do the job which the state wants them to do. That will be expensive. At the moment, we're getting higher education on the cheap in this country. Investing in higher education is one of the best investments that the state and individuals can make. British higher education is one of our most successful export industries, but we spend less than many other comparable countries on higher education. It's ludicrous to suggest that we should go cap in hand to hedge fund millionaires to make up the gap. Now, I may sound critical. I am being critical. I'm delighted to conclude that I've spent my working life, and a good part of my private life, I have to say, in British universities. It's been exciting and challenging. I've lived through a great expansion of the university system, and I think that expansion has been successful. Those like UKIP who seek to turn back the clock and reduce the number of graduates are just showing their ignorance. But I also feel frustrated. I think the system could be much better. It could be a system. I think we need, as I said, a new Robbins Commission. Meanwhile, we could do much more with what we've got. We can stop spending money in the wrong way. We can start spending money in more sensible ways. So I hope, for the sake of my grandchildren, that the next 50 years of British higher education will be at least as successful as the last 50 years. More has meant better, and even more, I believe, will mean even better. So to conclude, Kingsley Amis was wrong.